So when it comes to tire inserts, there are those who brave the installation process in hopes of reaping the benefits of reduced flats and improved tire feel, while there are others who pretty much refuse to touch them. And up until now, there hasn't been a ton of innovation in this space. Basically, you get an extra ring of foam material inside the tire to prevent bottom outs and reduce the chance of burping the tire. That is until relatively recently. In this video, a close look at the Odyssey OPTIS insert, which is an inflatable, tunable insert that's relatively easy to install and provides all the benefits and perhaps more than a traditional tire insert. So this is what you get in the box. The skeptics will say that it's just a $90 TPU inner tube with a nylon sheath and a pass-through valve, and they wouldn't be entirely wrong. Now, $90 might sound like a lot, but you have to keep in mind that the current state of the art for tire inserts is basically a foam ring that sells for between $60 and $80. So for a little bit more, you're getting a tunable insert that's much easier to install and weighs substantially less than a traditional foam insert. In particular, a medium-duty 29-inch Cushcore trail insert has a claimed weight of 212 grams, while a 29-inch Optis insert weighs about half that, at a little over 100 grams. Now, the most striking element of the insert is, of course, the two valves that protrude from the rim. One of them inflates the TPU insert, and then the other valve inflates the tire itself. Now, despite it looking like a pretty complex system, installation is actually really easy. I'd say almost as simple as installing a normal inner tube, but with a couple of extra steps. With the Optis, the insert is partially inflated and then installed on the rim first. And then most of the extra work comes from needing to use the included spacers to make sure that the depth of the valve system is properly set up to allow air to pass through to the tire. Now, once you've got the valve in place, the tire goes on over the insert without too much fuss. If you're used to running tires tubeless, you'll still pour in your preferred sealant into the main tire chamber. Now, honestly, you could probably get away with using a little bit less sealant since there's actually less air volume in the tire itself. But when I installed the insert on my bike, I just poured all the existing sealant back into the tire. Now, the one thing that I had an issue with is that the standard length valve was just simply too short for my wheels. Now, these are the Verum Velo T34 rims, which aren't particularly deep, but I still wasn't able to get a normal floor pump onto the insert valve, and I had to resort to using a compressor to inflate it. Fortunately, Odyssey offers the insert in a standard and a longer valve, so for me in the future, I'd probably opt for the longer valves for this particular wheel set. Now, one major benefit of the Optis insert is that it acts as a bead lock. The insert offers the primary benefit of reducing burping during hard cornering, but a secondary benefit is that because the tire sidewalls are being pressed outward from the inside, you can actually seat a tubeless bead with just the standard floor pump, and you don't actually need a compressor. So with setup out of the way, next comes the quote-unquote fun part. And I'm using air quotes here because I'm not entirely convinced that everyone's going to think it's fun to add yet another variable to bike and tire setup. For mountain bikes in particular, there's already an entire subculture of suspension setup nerds, and tire pressure itself is already somewhat mystifying to get just right. So to add another control knob, so to speak, for dialing in the ride feel might feel somewhat overwhelming. Fortunately, Odyssey provides a chart as a starting point for what pressure to set the insert to and what pressure to set the tire. Now, in my case, I've actually been doing all my testing on just the rear of the New House Hummingbird. Personally, I don't ever really come close to burping the front tire, and for me, rim strikes always occur on the rear wheel. Now, like I said, Optis does provide a chart for suggested tire and insert pressure based on your preferred pressure without an insert. But I have to say that I do find all these pressures to be on the high side, even at the softer suggested pressure settings. For instance, I weigh about 155 pounds, and I typically run my rear 29 by 2.4 Terravale A-line at around 20 psi. The Optis chart suggests running 23.9 psi in the insert and 18 psi in the tire for a firm feeling ride, and 22.6 psi in the insert and 17 pounds in the tire for a softer feeling ride. However, after testing, I've had to actually drop those numbers down to about 20 psi in the insert and just 16 psi in the tire to get it to feel just right. So I would say treat the chart as sort of a ballpark starting point. I think the main idea is to use the chart as a suggestion, but really to play around with the pressures and see what feels right for you. Basically, the only rule is that the insert pressure always has to be higher than the tire pressure. Otherwise, you're going to collapse the insert inside of the tire, which really kind of negates any benefits that it can offer. So riding around with the rear insert for a couple of weeks has actually changed my mind about inserts. I used to think that they were a ton of trouble to install and that they might offer some benefits that I would rarely feel or appreciate. For instance, I don't typically ride hard enough to burp tires. I also tend to ride relatively carefully, and I sort of choose my lines to minimize huge hits on the rims. So I was somewhat skeptical that I'd even feel a difference, to be honest. But I have to say that I could actually feel a difference right away. Now, it's not so much that the tire becomes super progressive or anything like that. In fact, some of my students and I have actually demonstrated that at lower pressures, tires actually exhibit regressive behavior, where the effective spring rate actually decreases as the tire squishes, in theory because the sidewalls don't provide as much support when they get compressed and start to bow outward. Now, if you want to read more about this, shameless plug, we've actually got an article in the latest Bicycle Quarterly that summarizes the study. Anyways, I think what I experienced can be broken down into 2 points. First, the tire felt more supportive laterally. Now, even though I was running pressures way below the OPTIS charts, I still feel that there was more lateral support when cornering, which did make hard turns feel a little bit more stable and controlled. And that's even if I wasn't on the verge of burping the tire at all. I think this has a lot to do with the fact that the insert is actually physically pushing outward against the tire bead and sort of on the lower portion of the sidewall from the inside, effectively supporting the sidewalls more firmly than with just pneumatic pressure alone. And then second, again, I'm not going to call it progressive in its compression, but I'll call it two-stage progressive. Basically, to me, it felt like a normal tire through most of its compression, but when you really compress the tire so much that you physically hit the insert, it of course suddenly jumps up in compression, and I think this is what really prevents rim strikes and tire burping from happening. Now, in these shots here, I'm riding up a curb and just totally sitting into the bike as the rear hits the curb, and you can see that the insert does a really good job preventing rim strikes. Now, without the insert, this is 100% a decent sized rim strike, but the OPTIS seems to do a pretty good job preventing it here. So to wrap up, I like the insert for its additional lateral support and rim strike protection. It's also significantly lighter than its heavier foam counterparts. It's also much easier to install than a traditional insert, but it does cost quite a bit more. The suggested pressures from OPTIS I feel were a little bit too high, and ultimately fine-tuning of the insert and tire pressure is going to be something that each individual rider needs to do themselves to get just right, which for some might be a positive thing, but I can also see it being another variable that some riders would prefer not to mess around with. So I'd say that if you ride hard and burping tires and denting rims is a common occurrence for you, this is something that you definitely would want to check out. Now, if you're more of an average mountain biker like myself, who doesn't push super hard, then the benefits may not ultimately outweigh the cost. Although, again, I do have to say that I appreciate the additional lateral support and the added rim protection even during normal riding. All right, if you have any questions about my experience with the Odyssey OPTIS tunable inserts, just drop them down below. I'm happy to get back to as many as I can. It's going to do it for this one. Thanks again for watching, and thanks for subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. We'll see you next time.